Okay, welcome everyone to Future Proofing 21st CCLC Strategies for Sustainable Impact. Today, we are going to take some time to look at strategies around sustainability from a variety of sectors, from the business sector, the nonprofit sector, the public sector, and the management sector, and see what we can glean as we think about sustainability for 21st CCLC programs across the nation. So we'll begin by introducing ourselves today. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Hillary. Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Andrew Francis. I'm a subgrantee TA liaison with the 21st CCLC NTAC, and I've been providing support to 21st CCLC programs for almost 5 years now. Before that, served as a out of school time program director and had to give serious thought to sustaining programs that I operated and led, as different funding streams, shifted and there were ebbs and flows, if you may. So very happy to be joining you today, but also bringing some of my experience from working in the public sector as well to look at how we can expand that and think more deeply about that for 21st CCLC programs. So happy to be with you today.
Thanks, Andrew. And to all of you who are here joining us, please introduce yourselves. We'd love to hear who's in the room, where you're from, what are the things that you're thinking about around sustainability. My name is Hillary Jones. I am one of the senior TA liaisons, and I'm pleased to be here with you today. And Andrew, I had the privilege of doing a lot of the writing of this session, and this took me back to some of the work that I've done and did, especially when I was in graduate school, around organizational leadership and learning. And that's what started me thinking about what all these other sectors have, as I thought about conversations I had with other leaders from those sectors as we went along. And so that's kind of how we're going to dig into our day today. As a little bit of a frame for all of us, we want to remind you that the 21st CCLC National Technical Assistance Center is here to help you obtain knowledge, skills, and resources to improve the quality of your programs and what you're implementing. And so we want to create professional learning opportunities that help build your capacity as all of you go back and lead your staff in this work. And so this capacity building falls into a variety of areas, but we are going to look very closely both at student focus, but today primarily we're going to think about statutory and programmatic requirements around this need for sustainability. And so today we are going to talk about these frameworks for thinking about sustainability from a variety of sectors. And then we'll talk about some principles around sustainability that you can use to inform as your practice as you work with your grantees in your state. We also want to give a little shout out that there are some additional resources coming soon on sustainability that you can find on the website 21stcclcntac.org. Keep your eye out for these, as we'll dig deeper into what this looks like specifically for 21st CCLC programs. But as we get started, we want to hear from you. What comes to mind when you think about sustainability? Drop it in the chat box. We want to hear from you. What is it that when we say sustainability, the first things that you think about? Andrew and I will say we hear a lot of the same things when we talk about sustainability. Two that come up over and over again are money and partners. But what are the things that you're thinking about? What do those look like? Andrew, the funding beyond the grant period is a huge one, right? It's one that we hear over and over again. How do I apply again? Make sure I get that grant again. How do I make sure it continues? And looking at those different funding streams for sure. Yeah, it's the money all the time. Dave McConnell said, money, yes, it's all about the money. And we would recognize that money is an important part of this, but we want to think about more than just money, more than just partners. We want to shift the themes that we think about beyond some of these traditional conversations that we're having to sustainability broadly across your program, because work in areas besides just money can lead to the money. So Our first example for this comes from the business sector, and it is these ESG metrics, which ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance metrics. This is a set of criteria used by investors, companies, stakeholders to evaluate an organization's ethical impact and sustainability practices. So these ESG metrics provide insights on how a company manages its environmental responsibilities, its social responsibilities, its governance structures, and they're increasingly important as they help assess the long-term financial health and the risk profile of a company while also reflecting its commitment to ethical and sustainable practices. So let's look at each of these. The first one is environmental, right? Environmental metrics focus on how a company interacts with the natural world. Key factors include things like energy usage and efficiency, where companies are evaluated on their efforts to minimize energy consumption and think about their use of renewable energy sources. Waste reduction is another critical area, and we'll assess how effectively a company reduces waste, recycles materials, and minimizes things like their carbon footprint. They also think about impact strategies, where they examine broader environmental impacts of a company's operations, including its efforts to mitigate climate change or conserve natural resources. So an example of this is in the hotel industry. There's an organization called the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, and they rank hotels on how sustainable their practices are, right? Have you seen those signs on your hotel room door that you can hang out that says, "I don't need my towels washed every day," right? Those are things that hotels are doing to increase their environmental impact. Another one is in the construction industry, there's something called LEED building certifications that says how environmentally friendly the construction of a building is. So then let's look at the social impact, right? These social metrics assess how a company manage relationships with employees, with customers, with communities. This includes evaluating their wages and benefits to assure that they're fair, that they're equitable, compensation is occurring. Workplace wellness is another crucial factor that's coming up more and more frequently. And this encompasses a company's efforts to provide a safe, healthy, and supportive workplace. Also, community engagement measures how a company contributes to and interacts with the communities in which it operates. That includes philanthropy, volunteerism, and partnerships aimed at social betterment. So, for example, Campbell's Soup has a social program around increasing access to healthy food, encouraging healthy living, and nurturing Campbell neighborhoods. So, places where it's located, where Campbell's Soup Company has offices, has buildings, has factories, they're investing in healthy food, healthy living, and in their neighborhoods. Another is Subaru Automotive, right? They have something that's well known as their Share the Love Community Service Day, where staff go out and volunteer in the communities where they work. This last pillar of the ESG metrics is governance. So governance metrics are focused on a company's internal practices and policies to ensure ethical conduct, and accountability. Risk management is part of this process as it evaluates how the company is making sure that their risks are reduced, that are low. They look at things like financial, operational, and even reputational risks. Ethical practices involve the company's commitment to operating with integrity, with fairness, and in compliance with laws and regulations. This integrity and transparency is also a huge part as they reflect a company's openness in their communication and the honesty of its business dealings. So transparency is often one that comes up a lot, that we hear a lot about. But we also see things like companies that are employee owned or consumer owned. An example that I'm thinking of is REI, the sporting goods store, right? And so these are things that businesses are looking at and that users of those businesses are looking at even. So what does this have to do with 21st CCLC? Because I hope you didn't get lost in that explanation. Let's reframe these ESG metrics in the context of 21st CCLC. What would it look like for us to provide a robust framework for evaluating and enhancing program effectiveness? So these metrics can help 21st CCLC programs align their operations with sustainability, with ethical practices, and community-focused outcomes. By adapting these metrics, 21st CCLC programs can better manage resources, improve staff and student well-being, and ensure transparency and accountability in practices. So this is an approach that not only could potentially strengthen program outcomes, but also ensures that 21st CCLC programs are operating in a way that supports that long-term community and educational goals. So let's look at it in more depth. These environmental metrics may no longer look exactly like how much water I use to wash the linens in my hotel, and may look like things such as organizational efficiency, where we assess how effectively resources like time, space, and materials are used to maximize program impact. It can look like understanding change management strategy and having a plan around it that guides programs through transition. So whether that's due to shifts in funding, changes in policies, shifts in even what our communities need, thinking about these environmental impacts and the change management strategy that we use in our programs is something that can enhance rather than disrupt services. So if we're preparing all along for the end of a grant and thinking about our plan around how we're going to manage that change, we're going to have more effective change occur. Then we can think about things like impact strategy and community engagement. These are central to ensuring that 21st CCLC programs not only meet their educational and safety goals, but also contribute positively to the broader community by addressing local needs and involving stakeholders in meaningful ways. Okay, then we have the social metrics. Right. Social metrics for 21st CCLC, as we reframe them, can look like things like evaluating wages and benefits to ensure that all of our staff are being fairly compensated and supported well, which is vital if we're going to attract high quality talent and then if we're going to retain them. Right. We want to think about things like talent development, where we think about the importance of continuous professional growth opportunities for our staff, for those who work for us, for the programs that we oversee, and enhancing the ability of the people that we are working with to provide high quality services. And so professional development is a sustainability practice and can be through this lens. Workplace wellness. We need to focus on creating those supportive environments that promotes the physical and mental well-being of all staff and all students in order to increase the sustainability of the work that we do. Because if our staff are burnout, it's really hard to keep them. And thinking about things like advocacy that highlights the role of 21st CCLC programs in championing educational equity, right? We want the students who need it most to get opportunities. And we want to make sure that there's access for all students. It's one of the priorities of the 21st CCLC NTAC, but it's also important that we understand that the work we're doing is designed to reach a group of students who are typically underserved. And so we can think creatively and should be thinking creatively about the social metrics that we use to measure our 21st CCLC programs and recognize that just as they look at them within the business sector, that in our 21st CCLC programs, as we think about them, they can improve and increase our sustainability. The last piece is the governance metrics. Governance metrics in 21st CCLC programs emphasize the importance of well-defined policies and standard operating procedures. And if you work in a state agency, you're probably talking about these all the time, but having those in place maintain consistency, fairness, and accountability in program operations. And so many of you have policies in place, but I'd encourage you even to think about things like standard operating procedures. What are you doing to assure that the person who comes behind you in your work knows how things are supposed to go, right? Many of us have stepped into jobs where there was nothing left behind from the previous person, and we feel like we're starting over. And high quality standard operating procedures mean that when a program director leaves, that the new program director isn't starting over from scratch, and that allows an increase of sustainability. And so if you can support your programs in doing that kind of work, that's a way to increase and improve your governance metrics. Thinking about things like risk management. Risk management is crucial for identifying and mitigating challenges, right? And ensuring that programs are resilient and adaptable to those challenges. So many of you do both fiscal and programmatic risk assessments. And so thinking about how you use those to improve the sustainability of your programs is one way to think about that. The next is ethical practices, where we think about maintaining a commitment to fairness, inclusivity, and respect in all aspects of our program. And so what are we doing to ensure that the students who need it most are getting to engage in our 21st CCLC programs? And what kind of conversations are we having with stakeholders around these? And then we have integrity and transparency. Integrity and transparency are foundational to ensuring that 21st CCLC programs operate openly and honestly, that we build trust with our stakeholders, our students, our families, our parents, staff at the schools that we work with, and really the broader community. And so what are you doing and what are your programs doing to increase this in your space? An example of this that I've seen recently is that some states are posting their program level evaluations on their statewide website, in addition to their statewide evaluations, so that people can look at what is happening in those programs. That's one strategy for it, but there are many more. And so that's where we want to hear from you. As you think about environmental, as you think about social, as you think about governance metrics, what are some things that are working to support this in your state, in a program that you've seen in your area? And so we want to hear from you, get you to add in the chat. What have you seen in your state that supports sustainability? And how do those things support environmental, social, and governance metrics? So drop your ideas in the chat, because you all have things that work around these topics. Andrew, a couple that come to mind for me in the category of environmental is key performance indicators, right? Those KPIs are one that many people have or share. Let's see, I have a raised hand from Alan. Alan, if you've got something you want to add, feel free. Just give us a second, so we'll make it so that you can unmute and share, or if you want to drop it in the chat, but we want to hear from you. You should be able to unmute now if you'd like to, and share what it is that you're thinking. Okay, you didn't have something you were thinking about. Nope, that's okay. We just want to make sure that if you have your hand raised and you ask to unmute, that you get a chance to share, because if there's something you're thinking about, it's good for the group. Some of this requires that think trust of who sees what working well. Another environmental thing, Andrew, that I'm thinking about is partnership development. It's a great example of how you improve that community aspect of the work that we do. And so we mentioned partners as one we hear a lot, but it is an environmental piece that improves the sustainability of our programs.
Yeah, Hillary, I was also thinking about resource management as well, because often we know that programs need resources to operate, and there's always a cry for resources, but it's also critical that we are stewards of those resources as well, and how we use them to help it sustain the program. So it means that how we manage those resources in a particular year of the program can determine, can I probably get another resource or do something else, within my approved budget, for another year, because I'm taking those steps to manage my resources so that I can sustain the program and the activities, as part of that process.
Absolutely. Um, and then let's think a little bit about some things that we may see in that social category. So some things that just come to my mind, Andrew, I think a little bit about, we've had this opportunity for people to work from home in some contexts and in some positions. And honestly, that's a social benefit that improves outcomes in your organization. And so I recognize that in out of school time, you can't use that everywhere, right? I need staff to stand in front of kids. But if you're a program director and have that flexibility to spend part of your day at home or,
Mm.
in some kind of other role, that's a social benefit that we can offer
Yep.
staff that helps improve our sustainability of our organization.
Yep.
Uh, I already mentioned those professional development opportunities as a sustainable practice. And so that's a huge one to think about. What about some governance ones?
So we know that we're implementing a grant that has a lot of requirements. And so it's important that we package some of that in our program manuals, so that those toolkits and guides that can be quick grabs for staff to review, but also as part of our onboarding or other processes, we are introducing them and ensure that they are fully oriented to the government procedures and systems, governance rather, process systems in place, so that can help them to be better prepared to support us implementing a high quality program.
Absolutely. Another one that I think about is the technical assistance support that we provide. And many of you are providing that on a regular basis. But when we do that, we allow the practice of our programs to improve and we give them the support that they need. And so that's a governance piece that helps support the management, the development of our programs in our spaces. And so we'd encourage you to continue to think about how these ESG metrics that are used in the business sector can translate into the 21st CCLC space, and what are the things that we can learn from them, because those are the places where we then can expand what we're doing to help improve the sustainability and outcomes. So I think that those are our lessons from the business sector, and we are going to move on to our nonprofit sector. And many of our 21st CCLC programs are nonprofits, but not all of them are. And we think that there's some things to learn from them. So the matrix map, or sometimes called the mission margin matrix, is a strategic tool used in the nonprofit sector. It's one that I used when I ran programs in the nonprofit sector, and it visually represents the financial and impact performance of various programs and activities. And so programs can plot each aspect of what they do, or you can plot each program on this two-dimensional grid, with one axis in the grid representing financial profitability and the other representing mission impact. And so this matrix helps organizations assess the overall health of their portfolio. And this visual representation enables organizations to identify which programs or components of what they do are strong contributors, both financially and in terms of mission alignment, as well as those aspects that may be draining resources or failing to meet their impact goals. And so this matrix provides insights in how to optimize resource allocation and foster strategic discussions about the balance between financial sustainability and mission fulfillment. So you categorize programs or aspects of programs or activities into these four quadrants in this high mission, high profit category, into this high mission, low profit category, into low mission, high profit, and low mission, low profit. And so the matrix map helps organizations make informed decisions about where to invest into, where to maintain, or even divest resources. And it ultimately ensures more effective and sustainable operations. So when we think about where we want to focus our attention within an organization, we're going to use these little check marks to help us track them. Organizations in the nonprofit sector primarily focus on high mission, high profit, and high mission, low profit quadrants when using the matrix map. And so programs that are in the high mission, high profit quadrant, they're ideal, right? They strongly align with the organization's mission, but they also generate financial surpluses, and that makes them crucial for sustaining other activities that fall into that high mission, low profitability category. And that's what comes next is this high mission, low profitability category that includes programs or activities that are mission critical, but they may underperform financially. These programs deserve attention to either improve their financial sustainability through things like cost management, through alternate funding, or by leveraging the profits from other program areas to that area. You'll see that there's a orange reddish check in the low mission impact, high profitability section. This quadrant might contain programs that financially support the organization, but they should be used with caution and they should be regularly assessed to ensure that they don't detract from the organization's core mission. So programs, and then the last category is this low mission impact, low profitability section. Things that fall into this category, they require tough decisions and they should be considered for restructuring, for strategic partnerships, or even discontinuation if they're neither contributing to the mission or able to sustain themselves financially. So as we reframe this map for the context of 21st CCLC, the matrix map can be reframed to focus on the balance between mission, impact, and cost, right? Because we're not usually talking about margin and making money in our 21st CCLC programs, but we can reframe this to think about high mission impact, low cost, high mission impact and high cost, and then low mission impact, low cost, and low mission impact and high cost. And so as I put my checks, you'll see that they kind of shifted slightly based on the language, but programs in the high mission impact, low cost quadrant are the most efficient and effective. They deliver significant educational and community benefits with minimal financial resources. These are programs and activities that should be prioritized and expanded on potentially because they provide the greatest return on our investment in terms of both the impact and the sustainability. Then we have this high mission impact, high cost quadrant, right? This includes things that are essential to the 21st CCLC mission, but they require substantial resources. These are things that are crucial for achieving long-term goals, and they need to be supported with efforts made to explore things like cost-saving measures or additional funding sources that can help sustain them. On the other hand, we have these low mission impact, low cost quadrant. these contain programs that are not resource intensive or activities that are not resource intensive, but also do not significantly advance the center's mission. And so these are things we need to use that caution with. We need to evaluate whether they can be restructured to increase their impact, or to determine if the resources related to them should be better and could be better allocated elsewhere. It's important to consider the capacity of your organization, of your program, in addition, when considering whether to do those low mission impact, low cost activities, because those are the things that take a lot of staff time often. And so we think of them as low cost because I didn't have to shell out money to buy materials, but they are taking my staff's time and they're not really making the impact that we want them to. Right. The last category is the low mission impact, high cost quadrant. This is the piece that we're going to have to look at critically. And we're going to have to say, hey, listen, this is not worth our investment. This is not worth the time, money, or energy that we're spending on this. Right. And, sometimes these are hard things to cut because they end up being the really cool things that we do, but they have high costs and low impact. So let's talk a little bit about what's working where. Let's talk a little bit about what things might fall into these categories. So we'd love to have all of you drop things that you've seen in the field, that you know your programs are doing, and what category you think it falls into. Andrew's going to add them to our matrix here, but we'd love to hear some examples from all of you and what you're thinking about them. So I've got a few to get us started. Andrew, the first one I'm thinking about is soccer club, right? Soccer club could be a really impactful way to build good relationships with students, to increase health and wellness, to give them opportunities for physical activity that they may not be getting during the day, especially if you live in a community where soccer rules, where everybody plays soccer. Kids will come because there's soccer, so they'll increase engagement, attendance. I have seen that coaches play an impactful role in young people. They're the ones a lot of times who can say to a student, hey, listen, what's going on with your behavior in the classroom? Like, why are you getting suspended from school? Right? Those coaches, they have a unique role in young people's lives. And so I would say that hypothetically, soccer club could be high mission impact. Soccer doesn't have a lot of costs associated with it. A couple cones and a soccer ball, some shin guards at the bare minimum, you could do with that. I mean, it's nice to have goals. It's nice to have some of the extras, but we can do a lot with very little when it comes to soccer. And so I would argue a soccer club falls in that high mission impact, low cost category. We'd love to add your ideas, things that you're doing or have seen occur in the field to our matrix as Andrew starts jotting some of these down, but I've got a few more examples for us. So what falls into that high mission impact, high cost category? Here's a big one, that one-on-one or small group high dosage tutoring, right? We know it helps us meet our academic goals that we're striving towards in our 21st CCLC programs. But getting qualified tutors and working in such small groups with those low ratios that high dosage tutoring requires, it's expensive, right? Just the staffing cost alone is going to be a lot. And so that's a high mission, high cost thing. We know we need to be doing it, but it's expensive. So we've got in the chat an example of a meal program like CACFP, so the Child and Adult Care Food Program. I would include in that other programs like the Summer Food Service Program or the National School Lunch Program, right? Those are examples. So where do we think that lands in our scope of our 21st CCLC programs? Well, we know the cost, low. Right? It doesn't cost us much to do that.
Low for us, right, Hillary?
What?
Low for our programs, right?
Low for our programs, right? It costs, right? The The people who are investing in it in our nation, absolutely, it's got cost. But for our programs, the cost is low. And because we know that the students who are eligible for those programs need the food that those programs provide, I would say generally that's a high mission impact. And so that falls in that same category as our soccer, right? High mission impact, low cost. So what are those things that are low mission impact, low cost? So one low mission impact, low cost thing might be, hey, we're having a paint night and the instructions being provided by volunteers. So we don't have to pay an instructor to come in. Maybe they're even bringing the supplies, right? It may not clearly connect to your mission and to your goals, but there's very low cost to it. And so one of the things that I said is sometimes these are things that you can do with partners to increase the impact of them. And by bringing in those volunteers, that's one way to do that. And so it can fall into that category. Another example, so we've got cooking clubs showing up in here. So cooking club absolutely depends on the way you do it, right? This one's listed as low impact, low cost. I think a lot of times our programs will say like the food is expensive to a cooking club. So if you can find a way to get that food at low cost, great. And I think the impact of it really depends on how you choose to approach it. Because if it's just like, here's cool recipes that we can cook, maybe it's not as impactful as we want it to. If we're really digging in to the math, to the science, to the health and nutrition components of what we're doing around cooking, it could also fall into that high mission impact, high cost. And so I would argue that that's one that has to do a lot with the design of it and how intentional we're being in what we do. And those are the things that you have to think about as you use this mission margin matrix, this matrix to think about it. One that I've seen that might have lower mission impact than other things that you do and high cost is individualized piano lessons, right? I've seen programs do that, say, this is something we want to do. We want to have these one-on-one piano lessons that students can take. But guess what? You're only getting one student at a time. And I have found personally that music teachers are very expensive, right? They have a lot of cost to them. Those people have high quality professional skills that are valuable, but unless you've got a fancy piano lab that you can have 10 students sit down to a piano at a time, it's really hard to do piano lessons in more than a one-on-one setting. And so one of the things that you might want to think about and talk to your programs about is how the different aspects of what they do fit into the matrix, because that informs the things that you continue, the things that you cut, the things that you push up, because, cooking club was listed as low impact, low cost. Could we push it up so it's high impact? I think we could, but we have to be intentional around it. Andrew, did you have any other examples you wanted to add? I rattled through a whole bunch of them. Oh,
No, I was just thinking as you spoke about this one, you had me put it on the cross line, even though technically we don't want things to be there. We want to be sure we're in one quadrant as best as possible, which is what you mentioned, like getting cooking to be that high impact, low cost. But I just thought a lot about some of the sporting activities that I've seen in relation to soccer. There may be even stuff around very popular gaga ball and stuff, but they become very low impact because kids are just allowed to just run around and have fun. And that's important for them to be physically active. But how do we build some social emotional learning stuff into that, so that every play there is a very quick lesson or a conversation or something that talks about responsible decision making. Why did you do this? You understand? Relationships, so that's sort of a thing in terms of being on the same team, or if you're being an individual in the competition. How do you maintain teamwork, but also your sportsmanship, those kind of things. Make an activity like that, especially if you're in a school or so that already has a gaga pit and balls available. It's low cost to you, but can be high impact as you're ensuring that it's linked back to your program's mission. of building social and emotional skills. I think Hillary seems to have frozen there, but I just wanted to highlight how important it is for us to think about, as we provide support, for our programs at the state level, how can we use this matrix to inform this programming decisions, making sure that, they align with our program goals, but also that they are in tune with our plans for sustainability of those activities as well. Hillary, you're back, and if you wanted to add anything about the matrix, if not, I can continue to just share with programs, with our participants that it's important for us to collect the information that can help us to analyze our activities using this method. So going through that list of activities that you have, and thinking about aspects of sustainability that we typically don't think about, but that helps us to really put these in the right quadrant, and then be able to make a decision. Okay, how do we make improvements to this particular program or activity so that it is more sustainable and it really aligns with what we're trying to accomplish, for our program, and by extension, impact our students and their families. All right. Thank you for participating and for sharing. I see board games as well that came up, absolutely. And we see programs with tons of board games from time to time. And, how do we, build those key skills, as you're saying, which can also be aligned to building skills around math, math and literacy as well. Those are important targets and metrics for 21st C programs. So how do we, use those social activities to also build, achieve some of those other goals using those kinds of activities. Hillary, anything else you want to add?
No, I think board games is a perfect example of those things that can be low mission or high mission, depending on how you do it. And that's the key. We want to be intentional, and we want to talk to our programs about that in order to encourage the sustainability work that we're doing. But I'm going to pass it back to Andrew, and he's going to talk about 2 more sectors from which we have things that we can learn.
Awesome. Thank you, Hillary. So let's talk now about the public sector and some of the principles that are used within that sector, and how that can help us to develop that sustainability mindset for 21st CCLC programs. So the 5 C's that are used in the public sector are curiosity, clarity, compassion, choice, and courage, really help to guide organizations, to achieve long-term sustainability. And what it does is that these principles help organizations to focus on the immediate needs that they may have and that they're addressing, but also what are the future needs of their communities that they're serving, and how do we manage our resources effectively and ethically to meet the current or the immediate needs, but also needs that may emerge, as we continue to work with those communities. So when we talk about curiosity, it really involves having that desire to learn and to explore new ideas. It's about seeking, innovative solutions. And we all know that with all the problems and difficulties that we face, it's important that we are exploring new solutions, innovative solutions that moves the lever of success and achievement for populations and for communities that we're serving. Now, in the context of sustainability, curiosity really drives us to be constantly asking ourselves a series of questions about, how are we currently conducting, our operations, right? Questioning our own practices, but also exploring new ways to improve. And so what curiosity really does is that it allows us to explore, what other resources may be available for us to achieve this goal. What other methods may exist that we haven't tried? Are there, emerging technologies that need to be incorporated in our plan of work and as part of our strategies? And as we're thinking about these resources and about the methods or technologies that we may use, at the base of it, we're thinking about how can these help us to achieve sustainable outcomes, right? And so what you'll find is that in the public sector, organizations are typically curious about how they can adapt and be more open to continuously improve what they're doing, what services or programs they're offering, because it is one of the key factors that helps them to achieve long-term success. Now, closely linked to that, as we become curious, is that I found, even working in public sector, that the more curious you are, it brings greater clarity as well to what you are trying to accomplish, because you are you are trying to have a better picture and a better understanding of the the larger whole of the processes that we're working with, but also what we're working towards. And so we're thinking as well about, what implication will this decision have on the population that we're trying to serve, or in the communities that we're trying to serve. And so what we do is that or what public sector does is try to have a clearer vision of the goals that we're working towards, but how will, the activities that are linked to that goal, how will that impact the environment, right? How will it impact the society? How will it have an impact on the economy? And so what that includes is that we're very transparent in the way that we communicate, or we should be transparent in how we communicate, but also we give a rationale as to why we make a decision, right? Because we want people to see that decision was made because we see that as being a clear pathway towards sustainable impact for society, for the environment, but also for the economy at large, right? But also we can demonstrate that these decisions are clearly aligned with our objectives for sustainability. And so what clarity does, it helps us to set realistic goals, right? To understand and to always be in a space we want to understand the emerging challenges that we face, and that we're making informed decisions that will contribute to long-term sustainability. The third C, which is compassion, is really having that understanding and concern for the well-being of others. And again, you've heard me talk about people. People are at the center of all that we're trying to do, right? But these people exist within communities, right? And communities are a part of our planet. And so we think in those in those boxes, if you may, or at those levels essentially, as we try to be compassionate, in offering services, in offering a program. And so what compassion does is that it drives us to be ethical in our decision making, because we're considerate of the impact that decisions that we make today, what will that mean for future generations? What will it mean for the environment in 5, 10, 15 years? Within your scope, as we talk further on, it may be a shorter timeline that you're working with, but you're thinking about the impacts for people, for your community that you're trying to serve. And so that fosters a sense of responsibility, as we try our best to, as public sector tries to want to protect the natural resources, but to promote equity, opportunities for all, notwithstanding what may be some of the disabilities or some of the challenges or some of the setbacks. We want to be able to provide, for the well-being of all our stakeholders. And so compassionate organizations are more likely to engage in practices that support social and environmental justice. And that has really emerged and come up a lot more in recent years, because we're recognizing more and more that we have to stand on these key pillars as we are compassionate in serving others and in providing services for peoples and for various communities. Now, with that, we are then encouraged to make choices or to make decisions that reflect those values, that reflect those priorities that we would have worked through, having gone through the process of being curious, of clarifying our goals, of having, of leading, and of serving with compassion, right? It allows us to make decisions that are grounded in our value system, but also in prioritizing those key areas. And so we're making difficult choices, or you find a public sector will make difficult choices between, various competing priorities, because there's so many things that need to be done. But we're thinking about, how will those choices impact the economy, but also how can we also take steps to protect the environment? So looking at those environmental studies that will guide our choice and our decision making. And so the principle of choice really encourages public sector companies, organizations, to make decisions that are aligned to their sustainability goals, because they're thinking, as we said, not just in the present, not just about the immediate, but also about the future. Even when we are faced with those, short-term trade-off, they emphasize that it's important to be intentional in making decisions that support that long-term goal that we have in mind as well, rather than just jumping towards immediate gains. We think about the future. And that really takes courage. It really involves having the strength to take risk, to challenge the status quo sometimes, but also to stand by the decisions that are aligned with those long-term goals, even in the face of adversity. Again, going back to this is what we are designed. We're clear on our vision, is what we want to do. And that guides our practice, that guides where we want to go, as we also look at becoming more sustainable. And so as we seek to achieve sustainability, it often requires that it probably said that there are bold decisions that are taken, and these decisions sometimes can also be unpopular decisions. But what courage does is that it enables us to implement those practices that we discussed before, to advocate for changes, and to also persevere through challenges that may emerge. And that becomes a driving force for meaningful action as we try to be sustainable and to overcome obstacles in doing this kind of work. And we can learn those principles from the public sector. I do recall my experience, where we're always on the lookout for new solutions. I'm always curious, but we're also engaging in that 5-10 year strategic planning process, that considers, okay, how did we do? Evaluating our processes and our activities, but also looking at, where do we need to make those long-term investments in those key sectors that will have those overarching outcomes for children, for families, right? But having the courage to make those decisions that are grounded in policies and grounded in evidence, as well as to really what works. And so the 5 Cs guide public sector organizations in developing that sustainability mindset that not only focuses on the present, but also prepares them for future challenges and ensuring that, we can be effective in serving communities over the long term. Not just a one and done, but how do we create meaningful change and impact over time? Now, in doing that, the 5 Cs really help to develop this sustainability mindset by guiding us to think about, the full spectrum of factors. So always, or most times, it's called public sector, right? So we're thinking about those constituent needs. We're thinking about funding trends, but we're also thinking about those external and internal factors or dynamics that influence the ability of the organization to sustain its impact over the long term. And so as the public sector thinks about the constituent mindsets, there are some key questions that must be asked in order for us to understand but to address the ever-evolving needs of people, and communities that we serve. And so that we remain grounded, remain relevant and impactful over time. So some of those questions may be, what are the top 3 needs that constituents have today, right? Do the immediate needs differ from the long-term needs? And if so, how do those needs differ? But we also have to think about how those needs have evolved over the last 5 years, going back to the evidence. What does the research tell us about how those needs have evolved? And do we continue to implement the same theory of change or the same approaches, 5 years after, when the needs have shifted, essentially? How well do the programs, address those needs? And, is there a demand for service that has remained consistent, or has that changed over the last 3 or 5 years? What does evaluation say about the program? In fact, have we evaluated the programs over the last 3 years or so? And as you think about those needs, we also consider the funding trends as well, because it's important to stay in front about current but also future funding trends in order for us to be strategic in planning for financial sustainability, right? We want to ensure that the organization can secure the resources that it needs. So I spoke about strategic plan before. That plan has to be costed. And that plan has to be costed based on current but also future trends where funding is concerned. And so the public sector will ask, so what percentage of earned revenue versus philanthropic support our organization receives, right? But also, how has this changed over the last 3 years? Have we seen a slide? Have we seen an increase in, in earned revenue? But also drilling down further to find out what are the main revenue streams for the organization. What percentage of that revenue, uh, you know, uh, you know, essentially has come from a particular, a sector or so. And what about the organizational reserves? How has that changed over the last 3 years? Is there a surplus being generated? You understand? And what does that look? What does that surplus generation look like for the last 3 years or so? But how is the funding environment changing? Overall, can we project that this will continue or it will change? How will we be able to mitigate any risk that may affect what we're trying to accomplish? And so in thinking about those two areas, we're also thinking broadly about the external and internal factors, right? So we're thinking about the broad economic conditions. We're thinking about policy changes, societal shifts. I couldn't help but think about the global pandemic, thinking about the economic depression. All those factors are important as we think about the external factors that may affect our program. But even closer home, within your immediate community, who else is offering similar services, right? And do they have a competitive edge over you? But is there space for collaboration? Because over time, I've learned that more and more, that it's important that we move towards collaboration where possible rather than competition, right? It all depends on your sector and what your organizational model may be. But in this work, where other school time is concerned, we can think about how do we collaborate, right? But you may be a for-profit company, or you may have for-profit companies that are entering the space, and their approach is maybe different, but you have to bear that in mind as you think about your organization. What about our community leaders or elected personnel, right? Are they supportive of our mission? And think about, by any chance, have you received any negative feedback, in or negative press actually in the past 2 years, and how that can affect your organization? There are also internal factors in terms of your staff's capacity or capabilities, but also your overall organizational capacity, right? What about operational efficiency? Are we as efficient as we can be in delivering these services, right? These can directly impact what we're trying to accomplish. And so we must ask ourselves the question in terms of, have we seen a significant turnover in staff in the last 2 years, for example? Always ask the key question about, do we have the right personnel with the right qualifications and the right attitude in the right positions, right? And just working over school time, we've had to make those shifts. In public sector, we've had to make those shifts. That this person is a good person, but this is just not the right position for them at all, right? Does the organization have a culture of excellence? And does that transcend all levels of the organization, right? Excellence is expected, it is promoted, it is, it's encouraged, but it's also facilitated, and people understand what that looks like, what that feels like if we have an organization where culture is at the heart of what we're trying to do. And so that also is driven by to what extent your board understands your business model, your organizational model, and how engaged are they in making those strategic decisions that will advance and move your organization in the right direction, right? And so those are some factors that you want to consider. Now, in thinking about those 5 Cs, we can also reframe them for 21st CCLC programs, and we can use this mindset from the public sector. So when you think about the 5 Cs, we can do so in these 4 areas in terms of thinking more closely about our program needs, the needs of our youth and also of our families, right? And so this mindset emphasizes having that deep understanding of the ever-evolving needs. And I've seen that where many times in our 21st programs, a grant is written, and then we implement the grant just the same right throughout, without thinking about how have the needs of the population changed since we started implementing this grant. And so it's important that we stay grounded and tailor our services, tailor what we're offering in terms of the educational services, the social services, whatever we're offering to the emotional development of our students. How have those needs changed? right? We may have different families coming in, students of different grade levels, right? Are we still being relevant? Are we still being engaging and impactful? And so as you provide support to programs, that's something that we want to encourage programs to do as well, that they remain relevant and impactful to their communities that they're serving, and that they're in tune with those needs. Funding trends will also change, and so it requires that for 21st C programs, we take a proactive approach in understanding and navigating those trends, right? Looking for diverse funding sources. Many programs that I've seen and talked to across the country, all they know is 21st CCLC funding, right? And so begin those conversations about, looking at other grants that may be available, looking at partnerships that you could establish with other organizations, but also looking at your own community and supporting them to look at the community and look at the options there, doing that community map to see, who else is within our reach that we could engage and partner with so that we can remain, financially stable, but we're not relying on just one funding stream. Again, the external factors as well, that we think about that as well, so that we remain an agile program. There will be policy shifts, there will be economic shifts, there will be, other societal trends. How do we, bear those in mind, and how do we pivot our programs so that we can adapt our strategies? We can leverage opportunities for students and also be able to respond to those external shocks or external influences that can emerge. But often, it's sometimes glaring before our eyes, the internal factors. But a sustainability mindset also focuses on building organizational capacity. How we strengthen ourselves internally to be able to respond to everything else that's happening around us, and that can look like staff development and having that clear professional development plan. Effective resource management. We must encourage and work with programs to be, more effective in managing the resources that have been given to them, but also having very strong governance structures and systems in place so that we can provide high quality services, but we can also adapt to changes as they emerge and be on that pathway to, meet and to fulfill our mission, but do so for as long as we can, and going beyond just, a single source of funding. So when you think about those key areas that I mentioned before, right, and thinking more closely about the needs of your families, of your youth, think about the funding trends as you're seeing them emerge now, where 21st C programs are concerned, external and internal factors. What are some questions that you think that you or your programs should be asking in each of these areas that would support sustainability? And I'd like for you to put those in the chat, and hit the original, drop them on screen for us using the annotate option. So what questions do you have in relation to program, youth and family needs, right? What questions do you have in terms of funding trends that, that are crucial when it comes to supporting sustainability? I'll take a stab at one while you're thinking where program needs are concerned. And it's linked to what we've been talking about in terms of the immediate and long-term needs. And the question is, do immediate and long-term needs of our youth and families differ, right? And you may have some needs that you share, or questions that you have asked, or your grantees. We'd love for you to put those in the chat and share those with us, because it's important for us to think about that, because if those needs are different, we like to know how. And it's a question that I often ask programs leader is, how have those needs changed or evolved in the last 5 years or so, right? But also your supply, your service that you're providing, has that changed as well, in any way over the last 3 years, or are we trying to do the same things the same way with different needs, and we're just having the difficulty, meeting those demands and meeting those needs, right? And it's also important to ask, to what extent are those needs, being addressed by other partners or by other organizations. So in the school days, so we're finding ways to supplement our supports there. When it comes to funding trends, we want to think about what the data is telling us about our programs. So, how has the evaluation of our programs effectiveness been over the last 3 years? You understand? So to what extent have we met our goals? Because that allows us to be able to, look at diversifying our funding, because we can definitely use that to tell our program story. That, with this funding, we've been able to accomplish this. We've been effective in offering these services. Can you also partner with us, to get things going in sustaining the program, right? Looking at what percentage of your funding, is coming through grants, but also what may be coming through other funding streams, right? And how has that changed over the years, right? How has the 21st CCLC funding environment changed? And is there a trend that's emerging? And yep, thank you for sharing that, Brittany. What are funders interested in funding, and does it align with the work we're doing? And one question I always ask, because I always think, sometimes my mind goes to think about sustainability from an activity standpoint. So I often think, as Brittany's asking, in terms of what activities could be sustained or through with support from existing partners or from new partners, right? Thinking about that, so we begin to align aspects of the program to funding streams to develop or create a program that looks a little different but provides similar services. And of course, for the external factors, who else will be offering those similar services? That's important. As we've mentioned before, is there a competitive or collaborative relationship with those other entities, right? What about the supports that we're receiving from our community leaders, from our elected officials, or from other stakeholders, right? Do we find that their support is divided? And how can we find ways to bridge those gaps, to bridge that divide, so that we can sustain our programs, right? Thinking as well internally about what level of turnover have we experienced as a program in the last 2 years, right? What does that look like? Do we have the right persons with the right qualifications serving? Just doing that assessment in terms of aligning staff skills and competencies with job functions, and thinking about doing any rotations where possible, so that we are more effective in offering those services. Those are some questions that you can consider as well, in terms of internally, your leadership. Do they have access to timely information? Is the information accurate? And how does that allow for them to provide the support and the leadership and the governance that your program needs to be effective? And so we hope that you can take this approach, in your supports with other with programs, to guide them through this process of using the public sector, sustainability mindset, to get to the heart of understanding those funding trends, factors internally and externally, but also the needs, and using that to drive the sustainability planning that's required. Thank you for sharing, everyone. Thanks for ideas around district policies and curriculum as well. As we move on to talk about from the management sector, and from the management sector, we're going to talk about a systems thinking approach, which really is a way to understand the complex but interrelated issues that organizations face. And really it focuses on viewing problems and opportunities holistically, rather than seeing them in isolation. As we take steps to recognize that every component of a system influences and is also influenced by others. So there are essentially 5 key areas that we talk about. It's understanding how the different parts of the organization or processes are interconnected, right? And so what systems thinking allows us for us to do is to create that more sustainable and effective solution, right? So let's talk about these actually 6 areas. So the first one is interconnectedness, right? And this concept really highlights that all parts of the system are linked and impact one another. So what we do in systems thinking is that we're thinking about, the connections and how if we make a change in one area, it's going to have a ripple effect on the entire system, leading to more informed decision making. So looking at how all these aspects of the system come together, how they're interconnected. The synthesis aspect of that involves combining different elements or viewpoints to form that coherent whole, right? And so this really supports the idea that as we understand the system, it is best to understand it as a whole. It is more valuable because than analyzing separate parts of the system, right? So when we understand the system as a whole, it allows us to be more holistic and effective in our solutions. And I've seen this work. We see this work. This has been very important in education because we have curriculum and assessment, we have teacher prep, we have school leadership, we have school culture, and so many other areas. But how do we see the system as a whole and make decisions that will have positive impact on all of those areas? When we talk about emergence, we're talking about the idea that the system's behavior and outcomes are more than just the sum of its parts, right? So as we leverage this concept of emergence, we're recognizing that though there may be complex behaviors and patterns that may arise from the simple interactions within the system, it can help to it can help us to anticipate some unexpected outcomes, right? So we're looking at those complex behaviors that may happen, right? But we're also understanding the simple interactions with the system as well, and using that to project possible outcomes that can occur in the future. Now, feedback loops are really cyclical processes where outputs of a system are fed back in as inputs, right? So we have this evolving cyclical process where the loops are crucial because they help to amplify or to stabilize certain behaviors within the system. So what that does is that we're able to take a particular output from the system and predict that this may possibly happen. How do we then begin to craft or to think about managing the changes that will occur by virtue of what we're seeing as some outputs from that? So the outputs are not just passed through and forgotten about. They are put back right in the system to help to inform decision making for the future. Now, when we think about causality in the system, we're thinking about the cause and effect relationships within the system, right? So we're looking at those different factors that influence one another, and we're tracing and going back to identify the root causes, but also developing strategies to address those root causes. So not just looking at the surface level at all, but digging deeper to understand what's happening more deeply. What are some of the precedent actions or factors that are causing us to see this happening in the system, and then how do we address those? System mapping, which I think kind of brings it together, is using a visual tool to represent the components of the system, but also how they are interconnected, right? And so this allows us to have that deep understanding of the structure of the system, the dynamics of the system, but also we can then use that to plan strategically and to solve problems, because we're seeing how different aspects of the system come together and how they may affect each other as well. Now, this we can also reframe from management for our 21st C programs, right? Because we operate a very complex system, but one that's also interconnected, right? And that's also true for education in general, because what it involves is just viewing the program as a whole and thinking about the various elements. So we always talk about our students, their families, our staff, we talk about our community partners, we talk about our resources. And all of these aspects are interacting with each other, but they're also having an influence on each other. And so as we take this holistic approach, it can help us to develop strategies for sustaining our program, because we are addressing the needs of all our stakeholders, but also creating that lasting impact for them that's also a positive impact. So when we think about interconnectedness and how it relates to 21st CCLC programs, it's thinking about all the aspects. So we're thinking about the academic progress of our students. We're thinking about family engagement. We're thinking about staff development. We're giving consideration to the partnerships that we're developing. And we're recognizing that the connections between all these aspects of the program allows a program leader to understand how the changes in one area, such as family involvement, can impact student outcomes. Because we want families to be engaged in the program so they understand exactly what we're trying to accomplish, and they too can implement activities at home to sustain what we're doing within the program. That will, of course, lead to more cohesion and for us to be more effective in our programming. If we're getting the feedback from families, but also we are able to share with them the approaches that they can take to support the program overall. But interconnectedness can also manifest in programs, where we see, for example, if students don't feel safe in the program, we can have a decrease in attendance. But if they feel safe, we can see an increase in program attendance, right? So that may manifest itself in other ways, where, for example, if staff are not ready to provide the necessary support and supervision for students, that creates a safety issue, right? If staff are not trained to be strategically placed within the program space so they can see and hear what's taking place at all times and provide support for students, that can create a safety issue. And kids will say, Mom, Dad, I'm not going back to the program because I don't feel safe at all, right? Things are said, things are done that makes me feel uncomfortable. And so we have to see how all of this affects our attendance one, but then it will have a ripple effect as well on our ability to meet other outcomes. Because we set targets for how many students will improve their performance at state assessment. But if we're supposed to have 50 kids coming to the program, but only 25 are coming, then we're far beyond that. And so that's all interconnected. When it comes to synthesis in our 21st C programs, we're talking about integrating all the various program components. Often program leaders see our programs as being, this is my attendance box, this is my academics box, this is my enrichment box. But how can we bring it all together, right? How can we find a way to bring together the academic support, look at the enrichment activities, look at the SEL aspects, and take this unified approach that meets the holistic needs of students, because it's one student, the same student, that's being offered and provided with these various services. And so when we take the synthesis approach, we want to ensure that every element, the hand of the program, the feet of the program, the eyes of the program, whatever those various activities and components are, that they're working together to support the overall mission of enhancing student success. And that's the key. And that only happens as we are able to synthesize all that we're doing. When we think of emergence, it's the idea that the overall impact of the 21st C program is greater than the sum of its individual activities. Again, closely related to synthesis, right? But what we're trying to do is we want to foster those positive interactions among students, among staff, among our community, our partners. And what system thinking does is that it helps the program leaders to anticipate, but also to leverage the emergence of new opportunities, right? Like, how do we build stronger community ties, right? How do we leverage, even unexpected student achievements for the greater good of the program? So the sum of the activities is really what is what is of greater importance than those individual activities. And how do we bring that together and leverage those new opportunities that may emerge for the benefit of the program? That happens as we create those loops for feedback, right? As we use our data, as we use observations from our program activities to make decisions about how to improve the program, right? So you may use data that's collected from student interviews or focus groups or the observation of program activities to adjust the program in real time. So kids say, hey, I think probably we should do I could say, let's have a break after school. Let's not go right into homework time, which I see sometimes in programs. And kids may probably stop coming because they're saying, this program it's just heavy at the beginning. Hilary, I don't know if you want to add a point to that.
I mean, even things like doing all this allows in the systems thinking recognizes that, hey, at school today we had something that happened that was serious, that was heavy, that was dramatic. And you can go through the list in your head of all the things that happen in all kinds of places, but that our youth might experience. And things like our interconnectedness lets us know that those things are happening, and those feedback loops allows us to say to our students and engage with the leaders in the school and say, hey, here's ways we can support this. And right, the allowing for creating that space for those young people to say, hey, it's more important than, instead of going through our schedule today as we normally would, emergence allows us to say, hey, no, we need to really take some time today to talk about how we're feeling, to be slow, to be intentional in our relationships, to help make sure that every student feels safe, that families feel that their students are safe, right? And having that space and thinking about yourself and programs as a system, but also within systems, right? Because that system is also impacted and connected to your school day, to your community at large. Andrew, as you were talking, I was thinking about an example from when I was running programs, that in our community there was a high instance of teen some violence, but just disruptiveness in our community in the evening after dark hours. And we started running what we were calling after school for teens above the age of 12. So if you were over the age of 12, you could come and you could stay till midnight. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday nights, which were their nights that were the highest,
Issue.
time when in our community police were picking up teens for vandalism, for disruptiveness, for just inappropriate behaviors in the community. And it was something that had to do with the interconnectedness that we had between the school, between the youth, between understanding what our community needed. And it really required that systems thinking to come up with that, because what it meant for us is those kids weren't coming straight from school to us. They were going to their sports practice, to their after school job, to whatever these other things were, and then engaging with them in that later time. But that allows for sustainability in unique ways, because it's something that the community sees the value in, that it sees the need for it, that it's been intentional around. And that allows that program to continue past the space of 21st CCLC, where people say we need this in our space. So that's what I was thinking about as you talked.
No, thank you for sharing that, because I think as you share those points, it brings me to the matter of causality as well, in terms of looking at the cause and effect relationship between, what we do in our program and how it impacts other things. And that only happens as we engage in those conversations and those system thinking processes with our stakeholders, with our partners. So with that, for example, we are able to track some data around interventions that we're doing in the program. For example, the one you mentioned before, that was more geared at behavior. I'm sure if you look at possibly the in-school suspension or other behavior data within the school day, that may have also been impacted in some way by what the program did. And similarly, if you're looking at implementing interventions like tutoring or mentorship, that can also have a positive influence on student outcomes as you set up those programs and of course implement them effectively using the evidence that's available. And so the idea is that as we use systems thinking, we're really in a position where we can identify the most effective strategies that will work, and we can allocate resources accordingly to maximize the impact for students and families. And putting all that together, systems mapping is a tool that we can definitely, and we should use, I think, in 21st C programs to understand the relationships between program components, right? How our student needs are driving the roles for staff that we are developing in our program, or if we have existing roles, how do we recraft those? And I think I've shared before, for example, where I recognized that family engagement was a serious need in a program that I was running. And so though everybody was a particular, professional, development professional, I begin to create different roles for those people as well, additional roles. So, for example, one of them was a family liaison because she lived in the community and she had a particular connection with other sport activities. So, whilst all of us, including myself, were involved in working with families, she had a unique role to engage families at pickup and at other points in time to help us to, to be able to, use those unique skills that are aligned to the needs of the program, but also mobilizing community resources as well. So as we engage in system thinking, we can also identify the gaps, the strengths of our programs, and we can be more strategic in making decisions. And I think that's helpful as we think about sustaining our programs. With that thought, we want to just launch, this poll, 2 questions, and we'd like, as you reflect, to share with us, firstly, which of this is a strength, in your sustainability plan? Is it interconnectedness or is it synthesis? And you actually have the opportunity to choose more than one of the options provided, right? Which of these is a strength? Is it emergence? Is it the feedback loops? Is it the causality, or is it the systems mapping where you have you use this tool to be able to map those map those relationships between the aspects of the programs that you support, and then identify those strengths or gaps. As you think about the strengths, also share with us, which of these would you like to implement or increase in your sustainability planning?
Andrew, you got me thinking about programs that I was running while we wait for some answers on this. And one of the very practical things that we did when I was running programs is we had something that we called program management meeting. And any new activity that we wanted to do had to come to our regularly scheduled program management meeting. And we essentially in that meeting did 2 things. We talked about the mission margin matrix, whether it was worth the investment of what we were doing. That was number one. But number two is we did the systems mapping work, right? We said, who does this affect and how? What other areas is this impacting and how? And it really required all of the people at that table because they each person stood or represented their part of the system, right? To say, here's the conversation we're having. And I think that that was something that was powerful, but I think a piece that we missed as we think about systems thinking as a whole in that process was that we missed the emergence piece, right? We missed that thinking about how the overall program or how the overall of what we were doing was more important than the individual activities because we looked at each activity as a standalone piece of what we were doing. And I think as I reflect on that, because that's what we're asking people to do, considering that systems thinking as a whole would have been more impactful and powerful in that process.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because that's important, because sometimes we are, we're wedded to a particular activity depending on what our role may be. If you're a lead in a particular area, and that's what you think about, but it must all come together and look at, as you said, the sum of it all. How does it really foster those interactions and allows us to, make those gains, for the program overall, but also looking at any new opportunities that may exist. Because sometimes we shut down or we resist those rather than seeing how we can capitalize on them. But also looking at I think for me, I even though this is what I do so often now, looking more so at any causality. What are the relationships between what different program elements, and how do we allocate those resources is what I call, or what's called in other sectors, the results-based management approach. You understand, in terms of looking at what's giving you that best buck, and are you going to throw out something that may not be giving the results then, but how do you probably adjust or make an improvement so it gets the kind of results that you're looking for. I'm going to throw over to you, Hillary, so you can wrap up in terms of what folks are thinking about as we bring the curtains down on today's webinar on sustainability.
So That's exactly it. We'd love to hear about what you're thinking about differently now that we've had some conversations around how other people are looking at sustainability in other sectors, in other fields. Share your ideas in the chat, the things that you're thinking about. I had the privilege to get to put some things in the screen on the screen that make me think differently about sustainability. One of the big ones for me is staffing, Andrew. I think it's a topic that very rarely comes up. But the reality is, if we have the right people with the right skills and the right support in the right places, that things are more likely to stand long term. But that takes investment over time. That takes planning for that as part of our sustainability plan. That includes, okay, if this person's going to retire, how do we think about that? How do we prepare for that? And I do love the mission cost matrix, the mission margin matrix. And I think that's a valuable conversation for us to have about the individual components of what we're doing, but also looking at it broadly. Andrew, did you have any things that you wanted to highlight that are standing out to you as you listen to this conversation today?
Yeah, sure. For me, definitely the systems thinking is what I'm running with. In terms of really using that to think about your program as a whole and the different components of that, and being very, very, targeted in, using that to guide, immediate actions, but also thinking about the long-term impact for your program as well. And sustaining that beyond, where you are currently.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, we would like you to complete the feedback form that Andrew dropped in the chat, and I will add one more time. We would like you to know additionally that there are some more resources for SEAs on this topic that are coming soon, so stay tuned. You can do that by receiving our newsletter or checking out our website, 21stcclcntech.org. Reach out to us with any questions at info@21stcclcntech.org, and stay connected with what's coming next, because we are really looking forward to some resources specifically designed for SEAs around sustainability. So thank you, Andrew, for your time today.
Thank you, Hillary. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.